Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia. This is Hall Monitor, the program where we discuss local government, politics, city affairs, consumer affairs, and much, much more. My name is Larry McGlynn, and I will be joined later in the hour by Denise Clay Murray. But first, we have a very big show for you tonight. It's going to be all budget all the time. And the reason we're doing this is because, first of all, budget's very important. And I kind of think sometimes when we talk about budget, sometimes people's eyes kind of glaze over and think, oh my God, that's so much to consider. And it is, right? The operating budget this year is significant, as is the general budget itself. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to walk you through what all that kind of means to give you a little primer on what the budget is. But one of the things I try to tell people about when I talk about budget is if City Hall and what happens in City Hall is kind of the engine of the city, right? Then the budget is kind of like the gasoline. It's the thing that fuels everything. And you have to have enough of it to do all the things you want to do, to get you to all the places you want to be. So that's why we believe budget is so important. The budget is also, to use another car analogy, I think, it is sort of a map of what the city's priorities are, what's important, what the city's looking at, what they think is important down the road. So that's why we find it very important, especially when we're talking about anti-poverty programs, when we're talking about anti-violence programs. So there's the budget, all these things cost money. Everything has a fixed price. And I think the budget is probably, it's, I think, the most important thing that happens in City Hall, because again, it touches everything else. And as the Franciscan nuns who educated me would tell you, with no money, there's no mission. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, I'd like to bring on Denise Clay Murray.
Hi.
Hi, Denise. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And you've had a busy, couple of weeks now.
Yes. But after today, I can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's not an oncoming train. The government, um, the United States government rested its case in the trial of, and I'm going to say this because this is the correct way to put it, United States versus Islam et al., or as most people are referring to it as the Kenyatta Johnson, Councilman Kenyatta Johnson case. The government wrapped up its case today. The defense starts its case tomorrow, and it's still anybody's game. I'll just say that.
Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the show, because I'm interested to see what happened today and what some of your takeaways are after the defense is rested when we get into the prosecution's rested and we get into the defense coming up. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about budget and where we are, because the city budget hearings began today.
Yeah, that's right. We were talking a little bit, me and some of the reporters that were there covering the trial, were talking about the fact that this was conflicting with budget season.
Yeah.
And that, we were glad that it was kind of nearing the end because, while we're all down with, truth and justice and everybody getting their fair shake in court, the bottom line is, the city's budget, which, took almost to the end point to get passed last year, is up for more debate. And ironically enough, one of the main people that helped get what was called the peace budget, or the budget that set aside money for organizations that were fighting the city's violence problem, is on trial now.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out.
Yeah. And I can tell you from what I saw today, because I watched everything it was over 4 hours, I believe, maybe closer to 5, of city council talking to the administration, the chief of staff, Jim Engler, the mayor's chief of staff, all the city departments were present. Not all of them spoke, but they were there in case questions came up. The city budget director, Marissa Waxman, who's going to be on the program a little later, Rob Dubois, who's the finance director, Tumar Alexander, who's the managing director. They were all there answering questions about the budget. And I think if we're reading the tea leaves of what took place today a little bit, I think you're going to see. I don't know if contentious is the right word, but it's going to be, I would say, a little more back and forth than usual, because City Council had a lot of questions and a lot of things that they wanted to see in this budget that weren't really reflected. And I think that's kind of creates an interesting dynamic as we move forward. And we're going to know more in the coming weeks when we start to see departments come before council.
But what everybody needs to remember as we go through this budget cycle is that this is the next to the last budget Jim Kenney will ever present as mayor. And most of the people that will be sitting there and asking questions of the mayor and the people in his cabinet are using this opportunity to put their hats in the ring to be the next person to sit in the big office in the second floor on City Hall. So what everybody needs to remember as they watch these proceedings is that look at it as the same way you would a lame duck Congress. You know how nothing has gotten done as we approach the midterms in Congress because everybody's too busy running? That you're going to see some of the same things here.
Yeah, and we're going to have a lot of council members on the show coming up, some of whom are interested in having that big office in City Hall. So it's going to be interesting. So before we see our interviews with City Controller Rebecca Reinhardt and City Budget Director Marissa Waxman, I just want to do a very quick overview. I think I have 8 slides here that just sort of give a little bit of a framework for what the budget is. I'm going to go through this, and if anybody's interested in hearing more about certain parts, let us know, because we can put it in a newsletter or we can talk about it in subsequent weeks on the show. So just let us know if you want to know more about any of this, or we can bring somebody on that who works in city government to tell us a little bit more. So I just want to make sure people get what they want out of this and get what they need out of this. So here is the slide I made myself. It's not bad.
Very good. Very good.
I just basically took our logo and added some type to it. So
what that's what it's there for.
Yeah. So the first things first, what is the budget? There's actually more than one budget. And that's kind of something that maybe if you're a casual observer kind of gets lost. There's the operating budget, which is the thing that we kind of talk about the most. And then there's the capital budget, which is a 6-year budget that deals with infrastructure. Okay. So the operating budget, think of it this way, is kind of like your day-to-day. Okay. So that's like things like the fire department, police department, streets, all those kinds of services. And then the capital budget is more of the long-term investment in things like buildings, infrastructure, like that. Okay. So right here, I've sort of shown you, and I've taken all these slides, with the exception of the first one that I did myself, from different presentations that the city has put together. So this comes right from the budget documents from this year. The differences between the operating budget and the capital budget. It's once you start to look at it that way, it's kind of self-explanatory. And these are slides we can put up on Twitter, on our Facebook page and all that, so people can take a look at it. But that's these are some of the key differences. All right. Oh, and I went way too far. So what are we talking about numbers wise? So this year, the operating budget, that day-to-day budget, is slated to be $5.6 billion. It's the biggest we've seen. Okay. Together, when you put the operating budget and the capital budget together, we're just over $12 billion total. Okay. And again, that capital budget, we're talking about long-term projects, and some of those things get funded by grants. Federal and state money comes in for things like that. The airport gets fees. The water department gets fees. So they have other sources of revenue other than just tax dollars. So we have a $5.6 billion operating budget against $5.5 billion in revenues. And that leaves us with a almost $153 million fund balance. Now you're probably saying, wait a second, those numbers don't add up. How can we have $100 million less in revenue than our expenditures and still have a fund balance of over $100 million? Now here's how. Some of this money is from years past and it carried over. Okay. So the city didn't spend all its money last year that it had in revenue. So it kept some of it. And now that's where we see this fund balance. Mm-hmm. Tricky thing about the fund balance. 152 million, almost 153 million sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But when you look at it in terms of what is recommended for the city to maintain in its fund balance, in reserve, this is woefully short. I think this is about 2 or 3%, and they should be keeping 17%, according to best practices. That's about 2 months worth of city expenditures. The city's never been close to that, and we'll talk about that. It's really because of the uniformity clause in the state constitution, which we talked about with Larry Eichel a couple of weeks ago, and our shaky tax structure that is subject to the whims of the economy in general, which again, we'll talk a little bit more as we go forward. The significant investments that the administration's touting in this budget are anti-violence, infrastructure, and education. And those have really, I think, especially education, have been the calling cards of the Kennedy administration from the beginning. So what we'll talk about here, when we look at the anti-violence, they're adding, when we talked about that peace budget, they're adding more to that budget for anti-violence programming.
Not a lot more, but more.
More, yeah. I think it's close to 20% increase, which again, not a whole lot of money in the grand scheme of things, but it's more. So they're going to be doing a little bit more this year. And there you can see some of the things they're going to be doing with it. Infrastructure has become very important over the last year or so. And, you also have to consider how much you're going to get from the Infrastructure Act that Congress passed and the president signed. So that's another factor. They're thinking about $80 million or so, if not more, for infrastructure projects when we talk about, roads and ADA compliance and things like that. And then the city is going to be putting almost $300 million into the school district, $50 million into the community college, and about $11 million for the Cato Scholarship. So you're seeing where the city has sort of made some priorities in terms of the money that they can move around a little bit. It's been explained to me, when you start looking at the budget, basically almost every dollar is accounted for before you even get started. There's a little bit of wiggle room, but not much. One of the things I'd like to show you here is, and I can't get that to work. All right, well, we'll come back to that. And we're going to talk about that when the city controller's on. But the capital program, just to explain to you how that works, that is a 6-year plan. All right, so it's not just a 1-year kind of deal. It's a 6-year plan for looking at the technology and infrastructure of the city, public buildings, all those kinds of things. And the reason it's that long is because when we're talking about all the property the city owns that needs to be maintained, it's significant. And you can't just look at it as a 1-year kind of thing. They stretch it out over 6 years so they can say, well, we're going to spend this amount this year. Year 2, we're spending this. Year 3, we're spending this. And that way it makes it easier for the city to tackle these problems and have a plan. So it's honestly, it's probably the best way to do it. The operating budget also works on a 5-year plan with projections that change when needed. And just to give you an idea of what the capital projects are going to be doing, there are kind of, the way that the administration is looking at it, they're kind of like categories, right? So creating an inclusive economy and thriving neighborhoods is 62% of that capital budget. So all the programs that fit in that bucket equal 62%. Okay. 20% to create a diverse and inclusive workforce, a safer, more just Philadelphia. So these are some of the things that the city has identified as priorities. And that neighborhood piece is going to be very important. We're going to talk about that in subsequent weeks because you're going to see a lot of discussion, I think, during these budget negotiations and budget hearings about neighborhoods and increasing neighborhood corridors, all those kinds of things that haven't gotten as much funding as maybe some people would like to see. So I think it's something that's going to be important as we go forward. And so then the question becomes, well, we're talking about all this money. Where does it come from? Right? So this year, in fiscal year 22 into fiscal year 23, we're looking at projections from the wage and earnings tax of being just over $1.5 billion. That is by far the largest chunk of the city budget, of the revenues that come in. The real estate tax is next. The Burke tax, which is the business tax, is third on the list. And then some of the other taxes, realty transfer, sales. There's actually about 20 taxes in the city. Not all of them are reflected here because some of them are smaller taxes and some of them do very specific things. But in general, this is what we're looking at in terms of revenue for the city. So that is our very quick primer on what we're going to be seeing over the next couple of weeks. And again, if anybody wants any more clarification or more discussion on any of that, just let us know. We'll be happy to have somebody come on and talk more about whatever people find interesting, and we'll make sure that happens. But now what I'd like to do is play our interview with City Budget Director Marissa Waxman, where she's going to lay out the city's goals in a little more detail. And then we're going to hear City Controller Rebecca Reinhardt from her perspective as a watchdog in the city, sort of explaining how she looks at the budget. But first, here's Marissa Waxman. Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 with Marissa Waxman, the City Budget Director. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the last time we spoke, you were updating us on where we were in the budget process. I believe that was back in January. So from there until now, what goes into creating the budget that was presented to City Council?
A whole lot, both the folks inside the budget office and all the city departments, and actually a lot of Philadelphians individually have been very busy in the past couple of weeks or months since January. We've done a couple of different things, starting with a lot more community engagement than we've done in the past. We held a town hall in late January with the mayor, several members of the cabinet, and close to 200 Philadelphians participated online, and we actually had translators in a number of different languages so that folks could share what they were thinking and what their needs were for the coming year. At the same time, we also held smaller focus groups, about a dozen people in each. Close to 100 Philadelphians participated in those, so we could dig a bit deeper to learn what it is that Philadelphians need, what they care about. And we tried to be very intentional about making sure that the folks who were participating in those focus groups matched the demographics of the city. Last year, we had done a survey. We got lots and lots of responses, but it didn't really look like Philadelphia as a whole. We did better this year. We tripled the share of African Americans participating in our outreach, but we're not quite there yet. And so we're going to be continuing to try and do better in coming years. We also had folks from all across the city evaluating all of the requests for new funding in terms of the impact on racial disparities. And so we worked with an outside racial equity consultant who helped evaluate departments' overall operations and approach to racial equity, as well as the specific things that they asked for new money for, graded all those in a scorecard. And that information was then provided to both the mayor's cabinet and to an entire team of folks from across city government called the Budget Equity Committee, where they then took that information and prioritized among, we've got so many needs and not enough money for everything. So we have to prioritize. And we really made sure that racial equity was front and center. And so they were slimming down and prioritizing based on what we thought what the outside consultant and others thought would move the needle the most on racial disparities. the same time, departments were working and refining all of their requests, meeting with the Department of Revenue. We were updating our revenue estimates, working with outside economists, trying to figure out, well, how much money are we actually going to have next year? And so all of that comes together by the time we get to March 31st, which was when Mayor Kenny introduced his FY23 operating budget and capital budgets, as well as a 6-year capital program and a 5-year financial plan on the operating side. And so a lot of work, both inside and outside government, to come up with what made the most sense for Philadelphia.
Tremendous amount of work, considering how big those briefing books are. One of the key things that we discuss on the show and are very interested in is poverty. So can you tell us a little bit about how this budget addresses poverty?
It does that in a couple of different ways. And, I was just talking about racial equity and how we were prioritizing that. And unfortunately, when you look at poverty rates in Philadelphia, that's where we see some tremendous racial disparities. And so through our general investments, but also by particularly targeting those to communities of color, we are making sure that we are getting the programming where it needs to go. And, poverty on the one hand is sort of a top level, like, how much money is in pockets. And we do have programs for that where we are trying to get more money in pockets by supporting the earned income tax credit and child tax credit and helping folks apply for that. We also, though, focus on workforce development. How do we get folks jobs so that they're earning more income? We also have more investments in relief and benefit programs so that folks aren't paying out as much through the TAP program for reduced water bills. But we're also looking at what are sort of the root causes and the real challenges and what's holding our city back and why we have such high poverty rates. And so tremendous increases in education. That is a sort of foundational need. And so, we may not see all of the positive impacts overnight, but this budget includes a $14 million increase for the school district of Philadelphia to bring the annual contribution to $270 million. It includes an increase for community college, bringing the annual funding there to over $50 million. And that includes funding for the Cato Scholarship, which not only provides last dollar scholarships, but also really addresses some of the needs of Philadelphians who, it's not just the scholarship dollars, but they need the wraparounds, the transportation, books, childcare, so that they can actually, follow through that and make sure that we're reducing the disparities in graduation rates from CCP. We're able to increase the number of PHL pre-K slots to 4,300. That's an increase of 300. That one starts the foundational education, of our smallest Philadelphians, but it also helps free up parents who have had childcare challenges get back into the workforce. We're in a real tight labor market right now, but we do see folks staying out of it because of childcare, because they need to take care of others. So we're making these investments in education and workforce development. And then finally, I will say that, our anti-violence challenges in Philadelphia are incredibly clear. And this budget has a 18.5% increase in our funding for anti-violence programs. And, we see such a coupling of poverty and anti-violence that it's really impossible to disaggregate the two. That was one of the best things in our community engagement sessions, was how often we heard that folks thought that everything was connected, that you couldn't talk about poverty without talking about violence, about education, about jobs. And so really, this is a pretty balanced budget that is looking at these root causes along these different streams and making sure that we're investing appropriately in improving programs in each of them.
That's correct. These things are all tied together, and this budget builds off last year by making what I think is the largest expenditure or investment in anti-poverty program I think anyone's ever seen in the city. Mm-hmm. So it's very positive development. But with that said, there have been some criticisms of this being a safe budget that doesn't take a lot of chances. Can you speak to that a little bit?
It's interesting. When I hear safe, when I compare it to the past two budgets that have been precarious, that have been, seen as had to reduce services and had to lay off employees, safe to me gives us a basis to actually recover. And it tells me that we're resilient, that we're rebounding, that we are making the sorts of decisions that means that we are able to maintain the day-to-day services that folks want, make sure the trash gets picked up, and as well as, like the basics, as well as really do the incredible increase in investments in anti-violence, in education. And at the same time, we are making sure that we're leveraging outside dollars, that, we only have a limited amount ourselves, and we need to take advantage of state programs. We talked about poverty, but I didn't even mention all of the housing programs. And we have our new neighborhood preservation initiative, and we have funds that we are leveraging from the state for rental assistance that are letting us do things that, frankly, city government never used to do. We're doing it creatively. We've really expanded what we do. We're also poised to take advantage of new federal dollars around infrastructure investment, the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act might mean a tsunami of federal dollars coming our way, but we have to be ready to take advantage of them. That means that, this is a budget that, it's not super exciting to hear that we're going to try and get more engineers on board. But when we're able to draw down $1 billion worth of federal dollars and really transform our communities and make sure we're maintaining the infrastructure we have and upgrading it and modernizing it for the future, it's going to feel pretty transformative. Even if it seems a little boring today to realize that, what we need are architects, and we're going to need to staff up on the folks to do that construction. But we are trying to be innovative in how we're doing that, making sure that when those federal dollars come our way, it doesn't just land in the same places it always has. We want to make sure that our Black and brown businesses are benefiting from this new stream of funds into our city and region. And so, not only are we hiring those architects and engineers, but we're adding staff in our planning commission for community engagement to make sure that we understand what projects we should be developing, and adding staff in our commerce department so that they can be engaging Black and brown businesses, so that they are participating in this. So we're trying to do things differently. I don't know that I'd call that safe. I'd say that we are really just trying to show our resilience and rebound from a really unsafe, vulnerable position we have been in for the past 2 years.
And speaking of money from outside the city, are you anticipating any additional funding from the Commonwealth? Because they're sitting on a rather large chunk of money up there that doesn't seem to be moving anywhere. Has there been any discussion about that?
So they're obviously in the midst of their budget process as well. And there's some areas where it really makes sense, and we're hoping that we see additional funding. I mentioned rental assistance. We're hoping education. These are things that, we understand we can't do by ourselves. So we are hopeful, but obviously they're in a process, as we are, but we do try and maintain conversations, budget office to budget office, obviously elected leaders to elected leaders, to try and see, what makes sense for Philadelphia as they've got dollars to spend down, because they are, as you noted, in a better position than us. Their revenues have gone up. Ours have remained somewhat vulnerable. The federal dollars we've gotten so far don't even fully replace our revenue losses. Whereas they've got federal dollars on top of tax collection gains. And so for them, they're in a different position. And we're hoping that does, in some ways, benefit Philadelphia.
Did the shortfalls in, by having fewer events at the convention center, fewer fans and games at the stadiums, did that create a situation where the bond repayments for those authorities are going to be affected?
So no, it doesn't, because those, when we borrow money and know that we have to take it back, that's a very serious commitment. We know that if we don't meet that commitment, folks will stop lending us money, and that's a real problem. And so Philadelphia has an agreement with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that on the convention center, we pay $15 million a year towards debt service. And that's one of our fixed costs that's sort of baked right into our budget. And in terms of the stadiums, for their debt service, that comes from the vehicle rental tax revenue stream. And that has enough money that continues to come in to cover that debt service. Where the lack of activity in our stadiums and at the convention center actually is a challenge in the city budget is the fact that we have certain taxes that, rise or fall based on how much activity there is. Our amusement tax, 85% of that comes from sales of professional sports event tickets. And so when those games aren't being played or don't have folks in the stands, that's less money. Also, what happens when you go to a game or you go to a convention? Drinking alcohol, liquor by the drink, that's money that goes directly to the school district. Our Philadelphia beverage tax, that comes in, that's And so it hurts our general fund and our overall collections, but the debt service for both the stadiums and the convention center is baked into our budget early, so that we don't, wobble in our commitments there.
Okay. These next two questions probably go together, albeit indirectly maybe. So how does this budget help people of color stay in their neighborhoods?
So what this budget includes, and not so much in the general fund budget, but because we've identified affordable housing as being such a priority for the city, we now have what's called the Neighborhood Preservation Initiative, which has borrowed money to do an array of affordable housing. And it's not just new housing so that folks can move in, but the most affordable housing is oftentimes keeping folks in the home they are in. So it is programs for basic systems repair and helping with retaining walls. And as well as a number of programs to help renters, either through rental assistance or support in the eviction process and counseling and diversion programs there. And so we have a number of housing programs through the Neighborhood Preservation Initiative and other ways that will help people stay in their homes, and particularly communities of color. On top of that, we continue to have a number of tax relief programs that for homeowners can be incredibly beneficial. For any old homeowner, we've got the homestead exemption, which the first $45,000 right now of your property value is tax-free. But we also have programs like the Senior Citizen Tax Freeze that for lower income seniors, when you turn 65, whatever your real estate bill is, freezes. If for some reason, your bill drops in the future, it will drop and refreeze again at the lower level, but it can never go up. We also have programs like LOOP, the Longtime Owner Occupant Program. And that's a program where if you're in a neighborhood and you've been there for 10 years and around you, the neighborhood has gentrified, the prices have gone up. And as a result, your property value is going up. If you're, and it's actually fairly generous income guidelines. If you've been there long enough, what you can do is get in the LOOP program and you'll see a reduction in your property taxes as well. So we have programs to reduce the cost of being there, help protect folks who maybe are at risk of eviction or foreclosure, programs then to just help folks maintain their homes. So, we understand very keenly that, it is far more expensive for us to serve a family in our homeless shelter system than it is to serve a family in the home they're already in. So we've got a lot of programs that we try and connect folks to help with that.
So with that said, we're looking at property assessments happening soon. I guess, so there's a couple questions here. Are those assessments, are we looking at that as a way to increase revenues in upcoming city budgets?
So the city budget that was introduced assumes 4.5% increase in assessment values. And we don't have those values yet, but it assumed 4.5%. And that, just sort of does go into the general budget as costs go up, but that's fairly modest. We know, though, that it's been a while since the properties were reassessed, and we think it's likely that the actual increase may be significantly higher than 4.5%. So for that increase, anything over 4.5%, what we're doing is we're sort of standing by and ready to work with City Council to talk about tax relief, talks about rate changes, rate reductions, and reform for any growth over that 4.5%. And so as that information becomes available and we've got sort of hard numbers to work with, then those conversations will get more meaningful about what this means, what sort of relief there will be or rate changes.
Okay, so that, and it's very early and no one's sure yet, but that could mean rebates, maybe a change in the millage rate, things like that.
Yeah, it could be trade-offs with, lowering other taxes. There's a lot of different options on the table. City Council convened a tax reform working group that has been underway looking at various options. So there's a lot of folks talking, but waiting till we get the data so we know exactly what we're talking about.
Okay. And the last thing I'd like to ask you about is about the American Recovery Plan funds, the $1.4 billion that the city received from the federal government that has to be spent down by the end of 2024. So right now, the plan is to use that money to fill existing budget holes. It comes close to doing that, about $100 million shy of doing that, but very close. However, what I'd like to ask, if we see a positive change in city revenues for any different direction, whether it be, the assessments or whatever it is, do you think that some of that money could be redirected towards anti-poverty programming, anti-violencing programming, those kinds of things?
So, I mean, absolutely. If we have more revenues than we anticipate, we'll get to make different decisions about what it is that Philadelphians need. We know that right now we're not meeting every need. It's a little bit, it doesn't really matter whether we say we're using the ARP, American Rescue dollars, or any other tax dollars, because they're really flexible. It's sort of like, you had a great aunt, you inherited some money from her, or you got a bonus at work. Doesn't quite matter. In your head, you might be like, oh, I'm using Aunt Gladys's money to buy a special something, and I'm using the work bonus to pay down my credit card. But really, at the end of the day, it's all the same money in your bank account. So if we get more money from tax revenues or somewhere else, it just means that we'll have more resources to do more for Philadelphians. Or, as we were just talking, or saying, you know what, we're going to reduce costs. There's always this trade-off. Do we want, more, pay more in, but get more services, or pay less, but maybe not get as much services? And so those are all the trade-offs that go into a budget. But certainly, if things go better than expected, that lets us make some easier choices going forward and make some new investments if that's what we think is in the best interest of the city.
All right. Marissa Waxman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.com. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, or on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. We'd like to thank Marissa Waxman for being with us. And she's going to be on with us again, as this process goes on through the spring. And she always does such a good job sort of breaking things down, I think.
Yeah. What I'm interested in seeing, and she's been on the show to talk about this, the $1 million of the budget that the public gets to decide.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking forward to those hearings because
next time we have her on, I should have asked about that.
Because I'm seriously interested in seeing how close the city is and the public is to each other when it comes to priorities. Because I get the feeling that the city's priorities and the public's priorities are real far apart in some ways.
And as I was alluding to at the top of the show, it seemed to me in today's budget hearing, you were seeing a little bit of a disconnect from what city council's hearing from their constituents, and maybe what the administration is looking at. So I think that, and like I said, I feel like there's going to be a lot more discussion in this budget season than maybe we've seen in the past couple of years.
And not just because everybody's running for mayor. Right.
Just because there are a lot of questions about, we think that money should be redirected in different ways. So it's going to be really interesting. And if you like this stuff like we do, it's really interesting. And there's a lot that happens that's sometimes surprising, and it's very interesting. So to give us a little bit of a different perspective on the city budget and what it means merely just by the virtue of her position, we did an interview with City Controller Rebecca Reinhardt, and the City Controller's office plays kind of a different role,
right?
And how they look at the budget and what they do in general, and how that factors into the city finances. So here is our interview with City Controller Rebecca Reinhardt. Okay, we are here on WPPM 106.5 with City Controller Rebecca Reinhardt. Controller Reinhardt, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we're really excited to talk to you because this is budget season. This is one of the most exciting times for us. It's kind of the Super Bowl for nerds like me. But your office came up with something very interesting that I'm thrilled to see, which is a budget primer for the public to understand the process a little bit more. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So we wanted to create something to make the budget more understandable. And my office is, of course, the audit function. That is the main responsibility of the controller's office is to be the audit function. But in addition to that, I believe strongly in making government more accessible and more understandable. And one of the things that is too often not understood and like a black box, honestly, is the budget process. So we decided to do a budget primer series, basically breaking it down, saying what exactly happens during the budget process, when does it happen, so that people can understand it more and can be more involved. Because in the end, I think that the more involved people are, the better outcome the process will be.
Right. And, when we're talking about a $5.6 billion operating budget, and over $12 billion total budget, it's just numbers that are very hard to comprehend. So this demystifies the process a little bit. So we've seen the first part. Do you know how many parts there are going to be yet? And when those next parts will be coming out?
We'll be rolling them out over the coming weeks. And they will break down other areas of the budget and get into details about the process. But our goal as an office is to have things coming out on a regular basis, because now that the mayor's budget proposal has gone to city council, it is in city council's hands, and the budget isn't usually passed until June. So there is this several month period where the public can be involved, and we want to get them more involved.
So what does your office do during the budget process?
Sure. So during the budget process, we weigh in on different aspects related to the budget. So in past years, for example, when the pandemic, I'll just give this as an example. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the mayor did a revised budget proposal, and that budget proposal had some pretty severe cuts to the arts in other areas, and also had tax increases in it. And I thought there's got to be a better way to balance this budget. I had my office look through the entire budget. And the thought process being that if the city's budget has gone up and went up $1 billion over a 4 to 5 year time frame, but yet resident satisfaction declined, according to the mayor's own resident satisfaction survey, there's got to be a better way to balancing the budget than raising taxes or cutting the arts. I mean, we're a world-class city. We shouldn't be cutting the arts, honestly. We should. So my office released an alternative budget plan and laid out the way, very specific plan, laying out the way that we could balance the budget in a different way without raising taxes, without these severe cuts to services. And that is one example of information on the budget that my office puts out to give to council, to help council, to assist the public in the process. Because my office, as the controller's office, I'm not directly involved in the budget. The mayor proposes it, city council reviews, makes changes, and then approves it. And then the mayor's administration spends the money during the year. But what I can do, and what my office can do and does, is really focus in on the analytics around the budget and options, because I do think that the budget can be managed better and want to give ideas to that extent.
So there have been some criticisms of this as being a safe budget, not taking too many risks, not making as many investments as some people like to see. Do you see it that way?
I see it as a status quo budget. Yes, I think it's disappointing. I do think that with where we are as a city, with violence at the levels where it is, our homicide rate is the highest it's been in recorded history, at least the last 31 years. And And with the influx of American Rescue Plan money, I think that there could have and still can be something bolder that comes from the budget process. Given where our residents are today, I think as a government, we need to be bolder.
So let me ask you about that. The American Rescue Plan funds are $1.4 billion from the federal government. The city received about $700 million last year. We'll receive about $700 million this year. And these funds have to be spent by the end of 2024. And, you know, other municipalities are using it for different things, maybe doing some programming. Philadelphia is using the money to fill budget holes. The city estimates they have about a $1.5 billion budget hole, which this $1.4 billion in federal funding will almost fill that gap. When we talk about those funds, would you rather see them be used in a different way for programming or different kinds of policy initiatives, rather than just saying, well, we're going to use this to make sure we don't run a deficit in a few years?
I think there's a smarter way to do this, to use these funds that could put some of it towards programs and towards challenges. My office put out an analysis of the American Rescue Plan money last year. And what we laid out was that, okay, there's $1.4 billion. The budget shortfall, the 1 year budget shortfall, was expected to be $450 million last year. So what I argued for and still argue for is, let's take $850 million of this ARP money, $450 million to fill that first year, and then declining amounts in the out years of the 5-year plan. Then you have about $500 million left that you could put towards strategic investments. And this ARP money is a huge once in a generation opportunity. This is something that is not common, to get this much money from the federal government with so little restriction. The only restrictions being that we can't use it for tax cuts or for pension fund. So I think that what it appears that the mayor's administration is doing is using the money, as you just mentioned, just to fill tax shortfalls. The problem with using so much of the tax of this money to fill a projected tax shortfall is that the city's not weaning itself off of the money on the revenue replacement side. There really should be a plan where there's declining dependence on that money for the next few years, and then there's money available to be used for investment, if that makes sense. This is what my office laid out in our plan. That is not what the mayor's administration has decided to do. And I think that, look, I think we need, of course, to have a balanced budget. I'm a financial person by training. Of course, we need a balanced budget, but we can do both. We can be smart and make some strategic investments in key areas on anti-violence, dealing with poverty, economic development, and then at the same time balance our budget.
And since the pandemic began, before we knew we were getting in this money, and up until now, what have been your biggest concerns regarding city finances?
Well, there's the long-standing challenges of city finances, the pension fund, and I sit on the pension board, and there's been some good progress in chipping away at that unfunded liability, but it still exists, and it is a big challenge, and it will be for years to come. As well as our tax base is very economically sensitive because we are so dependent on wage tax. So those are two, unlike most cities across the country. So those are two issues that are present. And I think that if Biden didn't win the presidency and we did not get the American Rescue Plan money, things would be truly horrible. Because we got this money, it's a blessing and something that we need to be using strategically.
And from now until I don't even know what an end date would be for recovery, but what concerns you most about our impending recovery from this pandemic?
Yeah. So I think that there needs to be a strong plan of return, right? And our downtown is, by all accounts, office occupancy is below 50%. And we've seen businesses leave. You can see the empty storefronts. And then we need to make sure that our Black and brown businesses in our neighborhood commercial corridors are thriving and getting the investment that they need. There needs to be strategic planning and vision around that comeback. And I don't see that currently. That concerns me. That is something, I mean, this city, Philly is amazing. We've got a great city. We're resilient and a great city, but we do need a plan and some leadership to pull us back. So that is concerning.
And so when we talk about some of those things, what are some of the elements or ideas that the city should be considering during this economic recovery?
Yeah, well, I think that we should be looking at what we can do to pull sort of workers, at least some workers, back into downtown, and then also looking at what we can do to put money into businesses in our commercial corridors. Cincinnati did a minority business accelerator, which was hugely successful. And our Enterprise Center in West Philadelphia has done great work. So I think that there are ways that we can be doing that. I also do think that we need to be looking at job growth and what can spur job growth. I mean, even before the pandemic, Philadelphia's job growth was below national averages on large cities, and job growth is important to our residents' health, our families, and a good job growth, family sustaining job growth. And we do need to look at how do we grow small businesses to encourage that type of job growth and help our people. So those are some of the challenges, and they're complex, absolutely. But those are some of the challenges that need to be tackled as we move forward coming out of the pandemic. And we have to stop the violence. I mean, that's the homicide rate, the violence, it needs to be stopped in order to fully bring our city back and make people feel safe. Make all over the city, people aren't feeling safe. So
that's right. So the budget's been presented to City Council, and City Council will now have hearings from this week, starting on Wednesday through May, and possibly longer. And then they'll pass the budget before July. With that in mind, what should Philadelphians be keeping an eye on if they're interested in this process, or if they want to learn more about this process? What should they be looking at? Oh,
well, people should definitely be involved and be present in terms of what's going on. It is a little bit more difficult now that council has been virtual and stays virtual, but I think that there's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of ideas put out there on how to best move forward. And the more that people can stay up to date and be involved, the better. And that's why my office wants to do the budget primer and the budget tool. That's why we do all that work to keep people as involved as possible so that people are aware. I mean, in the end, it's people's government, right? It's people's money, people's government. And that's the way I look at it. That's the way we all should. So I think absolutely people should be involved.
Well, and anybody who's interested in budget, which I think should be everybody, but they should start at your website, at the city controller's website, because it's not just this budget primer, which I think is excellent, but the budget tool you had mentioned, where people can hover above a graph and they can see what the expenditures are and the revenue, and it's fantastic. And it's the most comprehensive and easiest to use budget tool that people can find, because otherwise it's very difficult. You have to go through all sorts of. I have a 1-year-old, and the budget books are taller than he is.
I know.
There's a lot of information there. So I really recommend people take a look at your website. I know I do repeatedly when I'm doing this, because it's just a fantastic source of information.
Oh, thank you.
Controller Reinhardt, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right, we'd like to thank Controller Reinhardt for being with us.
I
Denise.
now have this mental picture of Owen, and someday you'll have to take this picture of the budget books and Owen standing next to each other, and because that would be hilarious. We should put it in the newsletter and everything.
Well, we'll try to do that. All right. Well, Denise, you've been following this trial. Tell us what's happening.
Well, following it as much as you can with people, sleeping in back of you because of how paperwork intensive it's been. Today, the United States versus Islam et al., otherwise known as the Kenyatta Johnson trial, the prosecution, the government rested its case today. Now, what was interesting about that, like when I came into the courtroom this morning, they were talking to forensic accountant Amy French. She's the accountant for the government, and she was being cross-examined and talking about how much money Universal had on hand, what there's been a lot of discussion on how much money Universal had on hand, whether or not Councilman Johnson and his wife, consultant Dawn Chavu, had overdraft protection on their accounts and how overdrawn they were. There's been a lot of paperwork used in this case, which is why occasionally I have this guy sitting behind me that's snoring. But today, it wasn't as much paperwork as people just reintroduced other paperwork to make their arguments one way or the other. After the government rested its case, of course, the defense asked the judge to dismiss the whole case, saying that they hadn't made their prima facie case, their primary case. But the judge said no. So starting tomorrow, we start hearing the defense's arguments in this trial. And what the defense is trying to say is that there was no bribe because A, Dawn Chavu's contract was legitimate, and B, this was something that the councilman would have supported anyway. So, that's where it starts tomorrow. They're looking at not only, substantive witnesses, but also character witnesses to come in and testify. To Kenyatta Johnson's lawyer promises to take up the whole day. But there was one person that everybody expected to testify that did not. Developer Ori Feibush was, for all intents and purposes, someone that the government talked to a lot in this case. They interviewed him 6 times, and he came up a lot in questioning. He ended up, ultimately getting the Royal Theater, which is at the center of the issues here. But he didn't testify. And a lot of people are wondering why that was. So hopefully we'll get some answers to that as the trial progresses. But maybe we've got another week and a half left. There is no court on Friday. My guess is the judge wanted to go to opening day 2 with the Phillies. But there's no court this Friday, and there's no court next Friday because it's Good Friday. But we should be done with this in another week, maybe 2.
All right. Well, Denise, thank you so much for that. And we will be back next week with Hall Monitor.
Have a good night, everybody.